He effed around, and he found out.
U.S. military forces captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro.
Maduro and his wife have been indicted in federal court.
The United States of America has successfully carried out a large-scale strike against Venezuela.
Breaking news this morning, President Trump says the U.S. carried out large-scale strike on Venezuela overnight.
Venezuela. Once at atop vast oil wealth, the richest nation in South America, its economy built on the world's largest known oil reserves. But by 2026 it was spiraling into chaos. How did a country with democracy and nearly unimaginable resources get here? Venezuela's 20th century story was a classic boom and bust. From 1958 into the 21st century, it was more democratic and politically stable than most other Latin American countries. And it built its society on oil revenue. Caracas grew into a modern metropolis, schools and hospitals blossomed, and oil tanker terminals churned out export wealth. But cracks appeared. In 1999, Hugo Chavez won election on a socialist wave and began nationalizing the oil industry. He promised to share the riches, but by 2013, when Chavez died, the economy was faltering, output was collapsing, crime was rising, and government spending ran wild. Public services broke down under hyperinflation. Even as late as 2015, Venezuela held roughly 17% of the world's proven oil reserves, the largest on Earth, but its output had fallen from about 3.5 million barrels per day in the 1970s to barely 1.1 million by 2025, for decades that heavy crude fed US and global refineries. But by the 2010s the well was running dry. Corruption and mismanagement took over. Power grids failed, hospitals ran out of medicine, and shop shelves emptied. Maduro, a hand-picked successor, clung to the presidency, but by the mid-2010s it was clear Venezuela was in crisis. International observers noted the country's fortunes were now more precarious after Chavez's rule and Maduro's rising authoritarianism. For the United States, Venezuelan oil has always loomed large, and 1975 State Department analysis bluntly noted that on the U.S. side, there was the need for increased oil imports from politically secure sources, specifically calling out countries like Venezuela. After all, Venezuelan crude is heavy, and U.S. Gulf Coast refineries were built to process it. In 2020, an expert noted Venezuela still held about 17% of global oil reserves, more than Saudi Arabia, even though sanctions had choked its production. In plain terms, a huge oil-rich neighbor is hard to ignore. The interest in Venezuelan oil is foresighted. Increased oil imports from politically secure sources, reads that analysis. Geography added a layer of strategy. Venezuela is practically in America's backyard, reachable by a long flight or a short boat ride from U.S. bases in Puerto Rico or Trinidad. Remember the Monroe Doctrine of the 1820s. The U.S. warned European powers not to meddle in the Americas. By 2025, some hawks were openly reinterpreting it. Critics mockingly dubbed President Trump's aggressive policy the Monroe Doctrine, a play on Monroe. Trump himself boasted that American dominance in the Western Hemisphere will never be questioned again. In other words, U.S. officials were dropping hints that oil and security interests might justify action. Nicolas Maduro was nowhere prince. He was a former bus driver who rose through Chavez's ranks to become president in 2013. But his popularity plunged as the economy collapsed. By 2023, Maduro grew desperate and pointed Venezuelans at a foreign target, neighboring Guyana. In December 2023, he held a referendum aimed at annexing the Essequibo region territory, covering a large part of Guyana that, since offshore oil discoveries, had suddenly become commercially attractive. Maduro claimed Guyana's oil belonged to Venezuela and urged voters to answer cinco veces sí, 5 times yes, a populist rallying cry that critics called a provocation. Guyana's government and the International Court of Justice warned the move violated international law, and independent observers questioned the referendum's legitimacy. Analysts noted Maduro had a habit of turning to the border dispute when he needed a distraction from domestic crises. And then there's the external angle. Reports and policy analysts have long documented that Beijing and Moscow maintain close ties with Caracas. providing loans, oil for investment deals, and diplomatic covert ties that helped Maduro survive politically and economically longer than many expected. Some analysts argue that the longer Maduro stayed in power, the more it drained U.S. political and economic bandwidth in the region. An outcome that, intentionally or not, advantaged Russia and China by preserving a friendly partner and keeping Western attention divided. The referendum was both a distraction and a warning, revealing Maduro's recklessness and the crisis's global stakes. U.S. strategists saw it as proof he could escalate fast, risking vital American interests nearby. The U.S. slapped on round after round of sanctions targeting Venezuela's oil and financial networks. In late 2025, the Trump administration publicly labeled Maduro's government a corrupt narco-terrorist regime and sanctioned his inner circle and oil tankers. The U.S. Treasury blacklisted key ship-owning companies tied to Venezuelan oil, even seizing one tanker at sea. Each sanction choked more revenue, pushing Venezuela's production well below pre-crisis levels. Diplomatically, Caracas was cut off. Most Western countries stopped recognizing Maduro. Some even expelled Venezuelan diplomats. The narrative switched. U.S. media and officials painted Venezuela as not just poor and authoritarian, but drug lord territory. In fact, Venezuela isn't a top cocaine producer. But that didn't stop it being called a narco state. Even the term Cartel de los Soles, a rumored shadow regime drug network, was officially designated a terrorist group by the U.S. Meanwhile, Venezuelan TV aired patriotic jingles about Guaido, their national hero, while U.S. outlets aired interviews with opposition leaders pleading for help. Secretly, the U.S. military was already positioning forces. Carrier strike groups and Marine expeditionary units were quietly deployed to the Caribbean in mid-2025. At Roosevelt Roads, Puerto Rico's old naval base, ships were refueled and helicopters staged. American SOF teams conducted exercises in Trinidad and the Grenadines. Intelligence reports later revealed U.S. planners had prepared prison cells and interrogators in advance. All this was invisible to the public. But Venezuela's generals noticed the warships on their radars. The pressure turned kinetic. Starting fall 2025, U.S. Navy and Coast Guard vessels began firing on small boats off Venezuela's coast, claiming they were drug smugglers. In a few months, they struck over 20 times, killing 80+ people. White House spokesman said it was necessary to stem narcotics, but experts noted Venezuela is not a main source of drugs and no proof the boats carried cocaine. President Trump even joked about the kills. No American casualties, he said, and noted a lot of Cubans died in the raids. Venezuela howled at this apparent aggression, but most world leaders mostly shrugged until the final straw. By late 2025, this multi-layer campaign had isolated and weakened the Maduro government. Maduro publicly railed about foreign conspiracy to steal oil, but privately he was preoccupied with coups and hunger. All that groundwork led to a shocking climax in January 2026. In the pitch-black hours of January 3rd, U.S. forces launched Absolute Resolve, a coordinated strike across Venezuela. First, stealth F-35 jets bombed and silenced Venezuela's air defenses and key military bases: Valencia Air Base, Puerto Cabello Port, etc. U.S. Navy ships enforced a naval quarantine in the Caribbean. Then, helicopters carrying elite Delta Force teams raced toward Caracas. Within about 30 minutes, they had breached the palace and Maduro's bunker. U.S. insiders later revealed President Maduro and his wife Cilia were awakened and whisked from the presidential residence. Cameramen on the U.S. side filmed the moment. Maduro, in pajamas, being led in handcuffs to a waiting Black Hawk helicopter. He never returned to power. The operation was over shockingly fast. In less than 3.5 hours, the heart of Caracas was breached, key military installations bombed, and the president captured. By dawn, Washington declared mission accomplished. President Trump triumphantly tweeted that Venezuela's leader had been removed, and said, "We are going to run that country and tap the oil." Casualties: Venezuelan officials later confirmed at least 32 Cuban soldiers died supporting Maduro's defense. Venezuelan state TV showed angry crowds and moaning wounded in hospitals. In Miami, Cuban Americans held impromptu celebrations across Washington. Officials lauded the knife-edge operation. The world reacted with shock and condemnation. U.S. allies and opponents alike demanded answers. Within hours, the United Nations Secretary-General said he was deeply alarmed by the U.S. strikes and capture, warning it could violate international law. Massive protests sprang up in Caracas and Washington, with slogans like "Hands off Venezuela." Back in America, Trump gloated. He called the raid one of the biggest in U.S. history and explicitly said the U.S. would run Venezuela, at least temporarily, to stabilize and rebuild the oil industry. He even reportedly told the acting Venezuelan president, Delcy Rodriguez, to do what's right or pay a very big price. Reports noted this was the largest U.S. military action in Latin America since the 1989 Panama invasion. For Venezuela, the old order was gone. A Trump-appointed interim government was in place, backed by U.S. guns. Critics say this marks a new chapter of American dominance in Latin America, a modern Monroe Doctrine enforced by F-35s. The fall of Venezuela has exposed raw power politics, a desperate dictator gone, an oil strategy unleashed, and a region on edge. What comes next? Only time will tell, but one thing is clear: the rules have changed.